Welcome, everyone. My name is Kelly Keegan. I am the VP of People at Built-in, and I'm so excited to be here with everyone today. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce Built-in and a few housekeeping points. Built-in is a recruitment and employer branding platform that helps companies recruit tech talent. We help our customers build their employer brand and engage high-quality tech talent locally, nationally, and remotely. We do this by being more than just a job board. Our unique platform and original content helps employers tell their story in a way that resonates with the candidates they need to exceed their goals. Just a quick note of housekeeping. Please know that if you have questions, you can add them into the Q&A feature and I will try to get to them. We're also going to send you the recording of this webinar so that you can refer back to it. In the future, look for more content on this topic. Everyone attending this webinar knows that 2020 has created intense challenges for employees and leaders in terms of mental health and well-being. I think most of us would agree that 2021 will bring more challenges as the world of work is upended again. We're here today to talk about some of those challenges facing employers and employees. For this event, we've partnered with One Mind, a global coalition of leaders transforming the approach to mental health and wellness. Daryl Toll, our presenter today, is the Executive Vice President overseeing One Mind at Work programs and contributing to One Mind's vision and objectives. Daryl brings more than 20 years of healthcare leadership, as well as personal lived experience of mental health struggles. I will pass it over to Daryl so he can share key findings from their research before we begin the panel discussion. Thanks for joining us, Daryl.
Thank you, Kelly. It's really good to be here. And hi, everybody. Thank you for joining such an important topic. I love to see people interested in mental health in the workplace. And boy, it is a timely topic as we really aren't even out of the pandemic yet. Something we talk about often is the impact or acceleration of the pandemic to something that existed already, which was a growing challenge we have collectively along the mental health continuum. At One Mind, we talk about mental health as a continuum that we're all on. And events like the pandemic impact that. This looks a little complicated, this slide, this curve, but it's important. And the part that's colored, the pink and the orange, these are pandemic effects directly. These are the actual pandemic wave one, the wave of avoided medical conditions, and eventually longer term impacts to chronic disease that the pandemic has had. The lines that are above that are around the anxiety and depression impact, another wave associated with the pandemic. And you see kind of a lag effect where the pandemic is happening, but as it does, people are becoming more anxious or rates of depressive disorder are growing. As the pandemic subsides over time, you see that curve continue to go up because the long-term emotional effect of something as substantial as this will go on and on and on and impact our families and our schools and our workplaces substantially over time. We can see some statistics associated with this, and I want to take you through a few just to give you a grounding before our conversation. Really interesting, before the pandemic, January to June 2019, 11% of adults reported some symptoms of anxiety and or depression. In a point in time assessment, 41%, the same assessment, January 2021, from 11% to 41%. That gives you a sense. And then essential workers, the impact that this has had on essential workers, 1 in 4 has been diagnosed with a mental health disorder. And I saw a statistic that really stunned me, which said that 22% of essential workers had expressed suicidal ideation within the past 30 days when asked that question on a survey. 22%. Unbelievable. So this has had a significant impact. There's additional data. If we go to the next slide, the cost. I like to focus on the human impact more, but it is costly. Depression impacts 6 to 7% of adults. Economic burden of $210 billion every year. The global economy loses productivity every year from anxiety and depression at a rate of $1 trillion. Massive impact. And that is a number that can be impacted through the decisions we make in our companies and in our cultures as we address mental health. Serious mental illness causes missed days at work, but so do burnout and stress. We can be at work and less productive because we're burned out and because we're stressed. And look at this, 1 in 4 employees reporting severe signs of burnout. It's interesting, I come out of healthcare and I was talking to a researcher on the topic of burnout in healthcare recently. And that researcher said something that really struck me. He said, burnout is a cover word for mental health struggles where it's dangerous to talk about them directly. So sometimes when we're talking about burnout, we're actually hiding the fact we're really talking about anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, other things that we're struggling with along the mental health continuum. Attention, the way we work, the way we focus is impacted by stress, by burnout, certainly by our mental health continuum positioning. And you can see it's 65% lower than it was before the pandemic. Teams need help. They want help. You can see 88% of working Americans want open mental health dialogue. They want their workplaces to talk about this. They don't want it to be something they have to bottle up and leave at home. And there's a gap. There's a huge gap. Ginger did one study, Mckinsey did another study that showed that leaders, look at that McKinsey study, 71% of employers, the leadership says, oh, we're doing well, or we're doing very well on the topic of mental health in the workplace support, but 27% of employees say that. That's a blind spot. When leaders think it's great and frontline employees don't, we're in some trouble. And you can see the bottom line here that 47% of workers need mental health support, and a large number of them aren't seeking treatment and aren't comfortable speaking up in their organizations about their need for support and their need for mental health treatment. This is a significant issue for us in our workplaces, and certainly the topic of our conversation today. There are things we can do, and we'll talk about those as we talk. Technology can be effective. You can see here that tech-based mental health care does increase access, and it increases use of therapy solutions and therapy tools. You can see 29%, 48% here. We'll talk in our conversation about culture, though, because culture can be an impediment to our teams taking on technology and using it effectively if they're worried about impact and a little bit fearful of leadership finding out who they are. There are other interventions that don't require huge investment. Peer support networks are amazing, where we have trained individuals in the organization that can support each other without going all the way through master's level or doctorate programs in mental health support. Flexible work policies, supportive supervision, mindfulness is helpful, breathing is helpful, helping people understand how to use that in the workplace. Financial well-being and emotional well-being and mental health are all deeply interconnected. And so the way those come together is very, very important. And some leaders in financial institutions, I was speaking to an individual that's responsible for retirement at Bank of America, and he was talking about this recognition that financial planning now requires emotional and physical health well-being as part of retirement planning for people to really thrive. And I love that a large banking organization is recognizing this and building solutions. And I'm sure we'll see that kind of thinking grow. Solutions do exist. We'll talk about more, but we do have a serious problem. It existed before the pandemic started, and COVID has accelerated it. And our return to work and our new workplaces will also be an important factor as we head into the future. And I'm looking forward to speaking with the panelists and with all of you today on this topic.
Thank you, Daryl, and also to One Mind for partnering with us on this very important topic. I think those are some really eye-opening and important stats to share. Companies have implemented strategies to address mental health, but the reality is that when they did so, we were already in the height of the pandemic. In other words, we were in survival mode. As the most devastating effects of COVID seem to be receding, we can shift from survival mode into being proactive. We can have thoughtful and deliberate conversations like this one today to consider what we need to do now and in the future in the way of mental health and well-being. We'll discuss overcoming stigma, the pandemic's disproportionate effect on the well-being of women and BIPOC employees, resistance that companies may have, and of course, we can look at the strategies our panelists know to be effective. Toward that end, I'm happy to introduce our panelists today. Noah Dagan, Global Mental Health Manager at McKinsey & Company. Kim Kivimaki, Director, Colleague Health and Wellbeing at Aon. And of course, Daryl at OneMind. So let's go ahead and dive into the conversation. I want to bring up an important topic that came up when discussing mental health in preparation for our conversation today, and it was the language and terminology being used. Oftentimes, leaders will avoid the topic of mental health out of fear of saying the wrong thing, or companies will use terminology that doesn't get to the root of the problem. Let's start with each of you sharing your approach to language surrounding mental health and how that affects your role. Noah, can you start?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you for having us here today. So this is a really good question, and I think a lot of companies, from what I know, are debating it, is how we use language to really structure out what we're doing and what we're thinking. And what's interesting, when I talk about what I do within my group within McKinsey & Company, I focus on mental health. So mental health, or if you think about it, between the relationship between mental health and well-being, there's a lot of groups within the world, within, even we're lucky to have really amazing people focusing on well-being within McKinsey. But this separation of well-being and mental health is really important to the way I think of what I do or how I think of this approach. Mental health, in my mind, is more on the clinical side of the world, right? It's where we get to, we really need early intervention. We need to make sure we have awareness and understand the issues that in a different way. I don't use words like problems or issues or concerns, because I think we need to, in some way, use our language to acknowledge which stigmas exist around the world, right? That there are stigmas around mental health challenges that don't exist around physical health challenges. We don't feel the same way about diabetes that we do about anxiety or depression, right? And that changes quite a bit between generations, between cultures, between locations, but using language like choosing selective language like challenges, choosing to talk when we talk about mental health, and we don't actually say mental health, and I don't add anything to it, is really selective, right? And having and knowing and thinking about what are people hearing, what will make them comfortable to reach out, how will we think about that? Yeah.
Thanks, Noah. I appreciate the perspective. Kim, are you able to share?
Yeah, and I also want to thank you for including me today. I think this is a really important question, similar to what Noah said. I would say that at Aon and in my personal life, we talk about emotional well-being, mainly because it's a little bit more holistic and it'll capture people at every end of that spectrum. So Noah mentioned that when she talks about mental health, she does it on purpose and she thinks about it in that clinical manner. And that's also how we think about it at Aon. Recognizing that there is still a lot of stigma around mental health. And so if we can get people more comfortable talking about emotional well-being and recognizing that stress, or to Daryl's point earlier, burnout is whether it's a symptom of or a precursor of a more serious mental health condition, then maybe we're able to start getting them to acknowledge that there are ways that they can access help without that stigma, so that when they're ready to move on to that next space, they're able to do so. And so it's actually a really timely conversation that we're having across our organization as well, helping people to understand why we're talking about emotional well-being and how that's a little bit more encompassing than just the clinical piece of mental health. Both are important, both need to be addressed, but one obviously is a little bit more encompassing than the other.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think, you bring up the point of the stigma around mental health, and that's something that has always been around. A 2020 survey by Maestro Health found that 63% of employees struggled with mental health condition, and 42% said it had a significant impact on their ability to do their jobs. But 51% were not comfortable bringing it up with their managers. How can companies help their employees open up without fearing that they'll be seen as promotable or incapable? Stigma is a cultural problem. Daryl, I would love to hear from you. Can organizations lead the change, or is this issue simply too systematic? Have you seen any particular effective strategies to combat stigma?
Absolutely. And it's related to the first question you asked around the language. A stigmatized issue, no matter what language you pick, that language will become inappropriate eventually until you deal with the stigma underlying. You can call ice cream anything you want to call it, and it will never offend people because there's no stigma around ice cream. And when we think about this, how do we make these really important human dynamics and continuums we're on safe to talk about? Because talking about it is how you get organizations to open up and to feel safe and not feeling afraid to even mention it or to use the wrong terminology. So we always encourage people to, one, try to learn the best terminology for your organization. Two, ask for permission to get it wrong now and then accidentally. And three, to be open and to talk about it. Since college, I've had a generalized anxiety disorder. And I was one of those 63% who would not talk about it for decades inside of my organization. I created that fear. I didn't know if I'd get promoted. I knew for sure I'd be judged. In my own mind, at least, I thought that. And so I didn't talk about it. I just kind of led and grew in my career and hoped no one would find out, and went to a therapist 2 counties away, and went to a doctor not on our electronic medical record, and kept the medication off the benefit structure. So I know that game. I know that people do that and they have to keep part of themselves hidden, and it's really unfortunate. And then I started talking about it, and there were some catalytic reasons why, but I started talking about it, and it was like an unburdening for me. But at that point, I was a CEO of a large organization, and it made such a huge impact. I have regrets to this day that I didn't do it sooner, because the moment a leader starts sharing a story, the team around that leader starts to open up and feel comfortable. That's the underlying answer, I think, to your question. Number one, leaders being vulnerable allows for organizations to become vulnerable. And our front line and our middle manager teams, they won't lead this. They won't become vulnerable first. They'll be afraid until leaders start leading on that topic.
Yeah, Daryl, I love that. Leaders being vulnerable allows employers to be vulnerable as well. I know that I have a therapist. I've openly talked about it all throughout COVID and all of our all hands, wanting to create that open environment and being vulnerable myself. And even recently, I shared with the entire company at Built In that if anybody is curious around like how I found my therapist or what I go to them for, just trying to encourage that more to reach out. And I've had 7 employees in the last month set up one-on-one time with me and just say like, thank you. I had no idea where to start, and just hearing your story helps. And so I hope that other leaders in particular feel more comfortable being able to be vulnerable and share those things. Noah, I would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I love what you guys just talked about. I think it's really interesting to think of stigma because there's so many layers of stigma. I think there's this component of self-stigma, right? That Daryl, I think, spoke about in a way, or I can very much relate to. I think it takes some time to acknowledge, even with yourself, I'm going through a mental health challenge. What does this look like for me? What is my experience within anxiety, within depression, or whatever it is, right? And then what preconceptions did I have about this? How can I put that together with my own identity, right? So I think there's this self-stigma, there's structural stigma, there's cultural stigma, there's generational stigma. Like I know all these stories of, like, if I think of my circle, my personal circle of telling parents or telling grandparents I went through this experience and them saying, like, what are you talking about? You did not go through this experience. This isn't something that happens, right? Like there is no postpartum depression. There is no, what it is. And just having those experiences, there's so many layers of stigma you have to go through. And what's amazing to me, like there's some statistics that I kind of refer to as 2/3 of people that have some kind of mental health symptoms don't reach out to help. And I wonder what that statistic will be today. I think it's old research. We actually have research coming out from my colleagues in the Center of Societal Benefit about overcoming stigma in the upcoming days. So you can hopefully see a bit more there and a really interesting research. But if I think of kind of, okay, we have 2/3 of people not reaching out to help or whatever that statistic is today, stigma is such a big part of that. How can we help people overcome that stigma? And organizations, like in many other topics, have really room to impact and have a ripple effect on society, right? For whatever we do, we have a ripple effect on colleagues, their families, their personal, like onwards and onwards. And there are things around, can we create discussions? Can we help people understand more what mental health challenges are? Can we create psychologically safe environments, right? Where we have, and the way I think about it is, can we create opportunities for a different type of discussion? It's not going to be, I think I have a hard time imagining somebody sharing in a group setting, you know what, today I had a really hard time getting out of bed. I can't, like, I think we need to create those one-on-one opportunities to have discussions, to role model vulnerability. Like Daryl just spoke about his experience, Kelly, you just spoke about that. As how do we role model vulnerability? How can we take off a mask of, everything's fine, everything's perfect all the time? Great, but what's, you have a kid in the background running around and you haven't slept in 5 days. I think COVID has changed the discussion. The Zooms where you're seeing your home. My children have been in every Zoom with every person imaginable within, Mckinsey, outside Mckinsey. I'm like, thanking God they're not here today, so we don't see them in the background. But like, it's created an opportunity for us to have a completely different level of interaction. And how do we build on that? How do we kind of create that? And I think one of the things we can really do is make sure that people have access to the right mental health resources, right? And we put it on par with health, with physical health resources. Like being able to see a therapist is something really important. Being able to see a counselor when you need one, having access to a EAP, all these resources are really important today. And I think also a lot of times people are just not aware they are around. Like, how can we make sure people are aware? How can people, there's so many questions about what happens when I go to a therapist. That's such a legit, and I have been, in therapy for years upon years. So it's something I have very close experience with, and I don't have a question in my mind like, do I lie on a couch? No, like those are not things I'm thinking about, right? But how do I find the right therapist? How do I find somebody who's right for me? How do I know if it's working or not? How do I know if it's effective? How can I trust myself and my instincts, especially in moments of challenge or crisis? I think these are all really good questions and things that we could all do as organizations, really.
Thank you, Noah. Yeah, I think that you brought up a lot of really important points and approaches that companies can take. The thing that I've always found so fascinating is that people so freely talk about like the latest diet craze that they're on or what their workout approach is. And no one hesitates to speak that or listen to it. And like they want to jump on board. And I wish we could have that same sort of approach with mental health. Kim, I would love to know what Aon is doing to be able to support that vulnerability to provide those resources to employees.
Yeah, I think you all mentioned something that we've tried to do as well. And probably the best example that I have is something that one of our UK groups did. So as part of our diversity and inclusion team, we have various business resource groups across the globe. One of our business resource groups in the United Kingdom is actually focused on mental health. We have others that have since started also focused on mental health. But that group in particular, about 4 years ago, created a video called This Is Me. And it was something that was completely employee driven. And they had 5 or 6 different individuals at all levels of the organization who just got on camera and were completely vulnerable and told their mental health and substance abuse stories. You know, this is me, this is what I do, this is what I experienced, and this is what I'm doing now to overcome it. And if you need to talk to me, here I am. We've since had that group redo that video and include people globally, which was also very powerful. But for us, that was like the first step, acknowledging that people have mental health issues, people have stresses in their daily life, and they're willing to talk about it. And we want you to be willing to talk about it as well. In addition to that, we've also started implementing mental health first aid. It's live in a couple countries. We're expanding it here in the US and in Canada later this year. Again, to Noah's point, make more resources available and help our colleagues understand that they're not alone. They have someone to talk to and someone that can help lead them in the right direction.
Awesome. Thanks, Kim. I'm super excited to check that video out. You know, on the flip side, I think that some leaders might feel uncomfortable about starting a conversation because it might feel like an overstep. Daryl, I would love to know your perspective around how leaders can check in with their employees without, you know, breaking the social contract to maintain boundaries or getting in hot water. Can you give us some ways to potentially broach the topic if you're noticing something?
Absolutely. So first of all, sometimes it helps to look at other industries. Take sports, right? Companies invest millions of dollars in employees to play within sporting events. And for years, it's been very appropriate for sports psychology to be part of the conversation. Why? Because work performance required good mental health, and there were aspects of mental health that were very safe to be part of investing in these multi-million-dollar athletes. One thing that's important in companies is to think of our teams that way. We're investing in these amazing, talented people, and their mental health matters to the workplace and their work performance. But that alone, I think, isn't enough. I think we need to transition in leadership to where especially our millennial and Gen Z team members already are, but most of us are going to much more of a integrated view of life than we used to have. You talked about this kind of social contract, right, or boundaries concept. And it's true, we used to absolutely pay for time and put people in buildings. And during that time, you don't bring your home stuff here and we don't ask about it. And that was kind of the deal, right? And it wasn't really a fair deal, but it was the deal. And now our teams expect different. One, the buildings are changing, right? In some cases, the buildings are going away. Or they're becoming kind of a hybrid place. I go sometimes and I'm home other times. And I mix my day up a little bit more. I don't work in solid blocks for 8 or 8.5 or 9 hours. I may do things throughout the day because I'm in a home environment or I'm not in a traditional work environment. So now we realize as leaders, we're paying for purpose. We're paying for work that's happening. And we're doing it across a seamless 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in which people are integrating work and life and which we have to honestly say is all life. It's all life. Purpose and love are the reason we all thrive. And so the workplace creates a big part of our sense of purpose and many of our relationships. As leaders, we have to learn how to lead and interact in that kind of integrated environment, which comes to the third point around, okay, with those realities, how do you do it safely? One, making sure people know that we care about them is always safe. It's safe to care about people. I care about you. I care about your life. I care about your family. I care about the things that you go through inside of and outside of work. You're not just a part of our machinery here. I care about you. Two, I want to listen to you. Listening, by the way, is also very safe. Listening is always safe. And that's something everyone should take home, write down. It's obvious, but we forget it. Listening is safe. What's not safe is being a therapist when you're not trained to be one. That's not safe. Listening is safe, and pointing people toward the resources that you have for them where there are professionals and there is support. Here's the thing though, you have to have those resources. If you don't have the resources, go build them. That's leadership, it's your responsibility, and you need to go do that. And there are a lot of ways to do it and a lot of ways you can get help doing it. You listen, you point toward resources, and then you check in again down the road to make sure that the individual is getting the support and the help that they need. More and more organizations are choosing to do assessments, qualitative assessments, meaning asking their teams, how is our support? How are you feeling? What are you doing? And quantitative assessments around the programming and outcomes that are being achieved in the organization. We highly recommend that because that's the finger on the pulse. That's how you know how things are going. When you get anonymous data from a department where it looks like everybody may be struggling a bit. What's going on there? Leaders need to know, and they need to go check into that. And that's where you start asking questions around safe areas of work, performance, supervision, and the ability for individuals to be okay. Everyone needs the I care about you and I want to know you're okay kind of conversation, and the listening leaders makes a big difference.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. I think that, letting people know that you care, super important. Listening, I think I've seen managers get stuck when they don't know what the resources are. And so it's the job of whoever is running your well-being programs or your HR team to make sure that you're constantly training your managers and giving them those resources so that they know, in the moment how they can answer that versus steering away from the conversation completely. No, I saw you go off mute a couple times.
Yeah.
I want to know everything that you have to say.
I find this really interesting because this is me and my mind and the way I simplify it, like the question we should ask really is, how are you? And what's amazing is how when we've done research on this, and this is organizational health practice, like how it's actually pretty rare. Like we need to ask, how are you? We need to ask people how they're doing. And I've been using this double how are you? How are you? Fine, okay, great. But really, how are you? And I think we need to find opportunities to do that are structured. So like as part of whatever it is, but also to be in all of us. And this isn't about, it is leaders and managers, but it's all of us as human beings and our duty of care to other human beings around us in the context of a global pandemic, right? Of like a little bit of stepping back and saying, can I notice if somebody, if I should check in with somebody, if something is going on. Things like, if they're in the Zoom age, if they're on camera all of a sudden, if they skipped a meeting, if they're on PTO all of a sudden, there's like, you can notice changes in physical appearance, changes in behaviors, changes in performance. There's all these changes that happen. And I think to keep in mind, mental health challenges look really unique. I think it's hard, it's really hard to tell. It looks different for each individual. So we don't diagnose, that's not our role as others, like unless we're like a mental health professional, we don't diagnose others, but knowing like this is a moment I should check in, I should pick up the phone and I should call and ask, how are you? I shouldn't wait till the next check-in. But this, like having that as part of who I am as a professional, or as a colleague, as a human being, like this is so critical right now when we're just in, as we're talking, the way we talk about it around the world, or what we're seeing, you know, mental health professionals talk about this is like we're in a mental health pandemic, right? So we know a lot of people are struggling. We just saw the data, our own research, you know, 4 times as many individuals are suffering from anxiety and depression, 2.5 times more people are like in suicidal ideations. We know people need help. They might not be exhibiting it. We need to ask. That is our obligation. And that's and it could be really simple. It doesn't, you can just ask, how are you? That's it. And you should listen. And I think if you do if you are struggling on how to have that discussion, I think it's in a confidential way. You can always like reach out to a mental health professional in your network and have that moment. Similar to what Kim talked about at Aon, we have what we call, our mental health program is called Mind Matters, and we have local points of contact that we train on. They are not therapists, not mental health professionals in all our locations, and they are a safe space for an initial discussion. Not confidential, not discreet, but I think having that type of person you go to is really helpful within a company.
I know my favorite thing that you said was the double how are you. I think, you notice that the how are you statement has almost become like a greeting, at least in America, where it's like, hey, how are you? How's it going? What's up? And so asking a second time, like, how are you really, I think is so important and can be so impactful.
Yeah, a colleague just told me just something like, if you don't ask somebody, how are you on Zoom, you'd never found out they broke their leg.
Yeah.
So we're the same way, like we would never know. So kind of the same level.
Wow. Yeah, that's like a little mind blowing to like think about. I would love to shift the conversation towards how mental health is impacting diverse groups. For diverse groups, the pandemic has amplified inequities that were already in place. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, 47% of women reported anxiety and/or depression. Only 38% of men did. Black adults, 48%, and Latinx adults, 46%, are more likely to report symptoms of anxiety or depression than white adults at 41%. Compounding this, BIPOC communities have long faced challenges to accessing quality mental health care, while they've experienced disproportionately high rates of coronavirus cases and deaths. Daryl, we know that companies have implemented DEI programs since 2020, but those programs don't tend to address the disproportionality of high mental health challenges amongst diverse populations. Is this the next evolution of DEI programming?
Absolutely. The way that mental health is correlated to DE&I efforts is powerful and important for leaders to understand. And there are really 2 dynamics or 2 aspects to it, I think, as we go into the next generation of DE&I. One is the idea of cognitive diversity in companies. Different from some of our other DE&I efforts, but cognitive diversity recognizes that talent and struggle go together. And to get some of the most talented people managing the struggle side, back to sports psychology, right? But managing the struggle side is important to get some of the talent. And the worst organizations would fail to recognize that and regress to the mean and just say, we don't want to deal with that level of talent. That would not be wise. And that wouldn't be something any company would decide to do, but many are doing it accidentally by not paying attention to cognitive diversity in their companies. And then you get to the impact of different populations. And that gets back to caring about people and the real lives they lead, and recognizing every one of us has a different stigma environment in our friend circle on the topic of mental health than the person next to us. We are all different, and we are all living in a way that's impacted by our own culture and our own view of stigma and our own view of what it means to be strong and capable and a leader, or whatever the case may be. And we have to recognize the individuality of the person in front of us, but also there's a lot of science around various cultures and groups globally and how this topic of mental health or how other topics impact individuals. We also know that trauma impacts mental health considerably. And so an individual or a population that has the likelihood of going through more trauma in a lifetime than another individual population will have the likelihood of mental health struggle that others don't have who don't go through the same kind of trauma. And failing to recognize that is also a failure to care in our organizations. So I would argue any diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation that's just about counting numbers or using the right words or addressing the right social issue, but ignores the functioning and thinking and experience of the individuals in our workplaces along their own mental health continuum and their strengths and their struggles, is missing a major component of the truest of the DE&I conversation.
Thank you, Daryl. I think one of the other statistics that really stands out for me, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, is that 1 in 4 women are now considering leaving the workforce or reducing their hours. They cite burnout as one of the many reasons. In a 2020 study, experts predicted that as many as 2 million women could leave corporate America. If these forecasts come true, the effects will last decades. People have fought hard to gain representation amongst women, and now we could see it in the reverse. Kim, I would love to hear from you. Are there issues particular to women that companies can address to alleviate their burdens and hopefully retain them?
This is definitely something that Aon has really been focused on and thinking about, especially as the pandemic has continued, and we've seen some of the struggles that particularly women and mothers are having in the workplace. So I think, some of those issues are things that you can do by supporting flexible work and making sure that, something that Daryl mentioned earlier, where we're kind of integrating work into our lives now and making sure that not only do people understand that that can happen, but that our leaders are letting their employees know that that's important and that that's something that we're willing to do to support them. We can also enhance some of our benefit plans and resources. So especially last school year when so many schools were remote or virtual and our parents were trying to figure out, how do I manage, especially those that had younger children, daycare being closed, or having to make sure my first, second, third grader can actually attend their Zoom class while I'm also working, was really important. So are there different things that you can put in place, like partnerships, tutoring organizations, or backup childcare, someone that can come into the house and help you if necessary? I think the other thing that we decided to do as a firm was put in a new short-term job protected leave. So instead of our normal personal leave being, you're going to be gone at least 6 months, we said, hey, we're going to put in a job protected personal leave. So if you feel like you need to take time away from the office, we want to keep your job for you. We value you, but we recognize that this is a challenging time. And so that's definitely something that we were thinking needed to happen. I think the other piece is just being open, right? So talking openly about mental health and well-being. I can't tell you how many colleagues I talked to over the course of the pandemic that were just like, I don't know what to do. I can't get it all done. Everything was fine and dandy when the world first closed down, right? So if you think back a little bit more than a year and 3 months ago, everybody was starting to go through lockdowns and everything's closed, and people were very open about it and flexible. But as the pandemic's worn on, that flexibility has changed, right? So it was new and it was different at first, but over time, remembering that everyone has a life and they're trying to fit work into it has become more difficult. And so I think that that's something really important for employers to make sure women especially understand. And it's something that we've really been encouraging our leaders to do for years, is talk about their own well-being and what are they doing. And over the course of the last month, I've been in 3 different conversations where, without prompting, leaders have just started or ended the conversation talking about what they're doing for their well-being. And one mentioned, I now take a lunch every day and I have lunch with my wife at home when I used to always sit in front of my desk. And another shared, flexing schedules, and another shared what they do after work. And hearing those stories from leaders is just really empowering, but especially for women who feel like they aren't going to be able to move up. The flexible working opportunity is hugely important for women. I think it always has been, but making sure that that's something that we're paying attention to, and then also paying attention to other issues impacting that BIPOC community. So sometimes they're the only person of color in a room. And when you get on a virtual meeting, sometimes that becomes a little bit more apparent than when you're sitting around a round table, right? You notice it a lot more. And so recognizing that and then trying to build diverse teams, whether it's women, people of color, some combination thereof, is something that I think all employers can do a better job with.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Kim. And shout out to all the working moms out there. I know I've had plenty of days in the last year and 3 months, which seems like 7 years. And I am not a mom where I'm like had breakdowns. And then I'm like, all the moms on my team, I'm like, I don't know how you do it. I'm so grateful for you. It is a lot. As the world is opening back up and companies are starting to go into the office, and we're shifting back into that return to office mindset, a whole host of new anxieties and well-being challenges are cropping up. Anxiety is certainly one of them, but there's also this new awareness of what affects an individual's well-being. For instance, I've heard many people bring up that the idea of a long commute significantly affects their well-being. Me, on the other hand, I'm like, I wish I had that 20 minutes to like shift from work into home life and kind of compartmentalize that. Would love to kind of wrap up this discussion with a question around how companies can prepare for a new set of anxieties and well-being issues. So Noah, let's start with you.
Okay, yeah, let's do it. So this research that was just shared about returning to work was offered by, again, our Center of Societal Benefit, who does amazing research on mental health, well-being across. So you can see more there. I think what they found, and I think is right, and you just talked about, is, there's a transition here. There's a shift and a change that adds a lot of stressors to people who, the way I think about personally is that their tanks are pretty empty at this point. We're not in the place when we were when we shut down. And there was something really, in a way, about the shutdown, lockdown that reduced this choice on a personal level, right? There's no like choice, you just shut down. Now there's a lot of choices, right? What do you go, to a restaurant or not? Do you go to a movie theater or not? There's so many choices that we need to make within our lives that adds a lot of stressor. So we are seeing people really reporting that their mental health is under additional stress. There's this idea of safety, right? There's safety for myself, safety for people around me, for my loved ones, if you have people who are not vaccinated or immunocompromised or whatever it is, right? There's some kind of loss of flexibility. Schedule commute, you just talked about commute, a balancing personal and work within one given day. And it impacts more vulnerable groups, right? Like caregivers, right? It impacts them disproportionately. And they're really reporting that they have more anxiety about these stressors and about this return to work. And I think if you think about how to prepare, what I try to keep in mind is we're all maybe in the same storm, but we're really not in the same boat. We have completely different circumstances. In many ways, we have to ask, what each person needs and wants. On the other hand, people really want communications and want certainty. The anxiety of the uncertainty sometimes is much larger than what they would figure out. And it's hard to create certainty right now, but whatever we can about what's coming up. And then trying to create choices and places for people to choose what will work for them. And this is a little bit of what's coming up. I really like this mental health pandemic. We're not it's starting in a way, or wherever we are within it. There's going to be such need for mental health support within the workplace, and how to make that part of whatever plans we make, right? How do we incorporate that in?
Wonderful, thank you, Noah. As we are getting close to the hour, and unfortunately our time ending together, I would love to do a quick round robin of if you had to leave the audience with one piece of advice as they navigate the future of mental health at work, what would it be? Daryl, we can start with you.
Well, first of all, just to tack on to Noah's comment, I think it really is important to re-onboard our teams right now as if they're starting over. People can adjust to almost anything. We're amazing. If we're given permission to do so, if there are signals that it's a new time and it is time for a change, and if there's a pathway created. But really, all of these things we've talked about today, to your question, if we care, it makes a difference. And for leaders, time is required. What we care about happens in our companies, and time is required to care. So we need to make sure that our leadership teams have time and training that allow for and set the expectation that they care, and that time and that training is aimed toward caring about our teams and addressing the change and addressing mental health, destigmatizing and creating support and environments where people can thrive. We'll all be a lot happier in that kind of workplace. And I would say time and caring would be my big takeaway.
Thanks, Daryl. Kim, I'll hand it over to you. One piece of advice.
So I think for me, it's similar to Daryl, but I went about it a different way. I think listening is the biggest piece of advice. So take time to listen to what people are saying and what they're not saying. I think it's important that we listen to what people are saying about our work environment, especially as we're transitioning back into offices. What is it that's causing that anxiety for folks? What is working well? What isn't? What are people saying about you as a company? So are they happy? Do they seem happy? Are they kind of, oh? And then also, most importantly, their feelings. So asking the question twice, how are you, to Noah's point, and really listening is important. I think the other piece is also listening to what our leaders are saying and how they're talking about well-being. So at least at Aon, our leaders didn't do a good job talking about well-being in the past. Some did, some didn't. As long as they're continuing to talk about it, I think we'll be okay. But when they start going back to focusing more on the job and less on their people and how people are feeling, then as an employee and as another leader, it's our job to react. And so I think listening is going to be really important over the course, of forever, but especially the next couple months.
Thanks, Kim. Noah?
I think the way and these are all really great things to take home, but I think the biggest one for me is we are in a moment in time where there is a unique opportunity to make a fundamental change in the world on how we talk about it and think about mental health. And I hope we all seize that opportunity, because if there's a world I'd love to see change, this would be the one, personally and professionally. We're excited to see that happen.
Thanks, Noah. I'm excited too. And I will leave you all with my piece of advice, which doesn't require taking any notes for this. It's very simple. And I would love everybody to do it with me right now, which is go ahead and just take a deep breath in and exhale. I think we're going from meeting to meeting and Zoom to Zoom, and we can forget to take just some space for ourselves. And so that's my advice for all of you, is just to take some space and encourage your teams to also do the same. To all of our attendees today, we hope that you enjoyed the panel. At Built-in, we're committed to providing our community with resources to thrive now and in the future. A very special thank you to our panelists for sharing their advice and experiences today. We ask that everyone please complete our survey, which we rely on to continue providing webinars and content that you value. Meanwhile, if you're interested in more conversations about pressing issues facing people leaders, Built-in's new podcast is launching in a few weeks, Technically People. It features experts who offer a blend of theory and practice, including big ideas about DEI, learning and development, wellness, remote and hybrid environments, candidate preferences, ethics and AI, and so much more. Follow the LinkedIn page at Technically People, where we will announce the launch and keep the conversation going. Thank you, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.